The Feldwebel found the first Waco nose down in a Dutch pasture, its fabric skin peeled back like something had gutted it from the inside. Plywood spars jutted from the fuselage at angles that suggested a hard landing, not a crash. Someone had walked away from this. He circled the wreck, cataloging damage the way rear area NCOs do when frontline officers want paperwork instead of answers. Control cables severed post-landing, cargo tie-downs cut with a knife, not sheared by impact, and an American flight log, water-stained but legible, stuffed behind the rudder pedals. He moved to the second glider, 60 meters south. Same story. Same deliberate gutting. Ration wrappers. American K-ration packaging. The waxy cardboard kind Wehrmacht intelligence had catalogued in their recognition manuals since North Africa. Bandage strips. Boot prints in the soft ground. Dozens of them. Heading west in a column so orderly, it looked like a formation march rather than a retreat. The holding pen stopped him cold. 300 meters from the glider field, a temporary enclosure, barbed wire strung between fence posts, a drainage ditch repurposed as a latrine, matted grass where men had slept in rows. The Feldwebel counted impressions. 40, maybe 60 bodies had lain here. German ration tins littered the perimeter, which meant Wehrmacht guards had fed whoever occupied this space. But the wire had been cut from the outside, cleanly, in 3 places. Neither guards nor prisoners remained. The boot tracks from the gliders merged with a broader set of tracks leading out of the pen's western gap, and all of them, pilots, prisoners, whoever else, pointed toward Allied lines. He had a problem that no amount of paperwork could fix. 60 Allied prisoners of war, held under German custody, had vanished from a position 90 miles behind the front. American glider pilots, men the Wehrmacht classified as expendable taxi drivers, soldiers who delivered cargo and then surrendered or died, had landed, freed the prisoners, and walked west into occupied Holland. They hadn't fought their way out, or driven west in stolen vehicles. They had walked through German-controlled territory, past supply depots and garrison towns, and Feld gendarmerie checkpoints and local police stations, carrying wounded men who couldn't move under their own power. The report he filed used the word unerklärlich, inexplicable, their word, not mine. If you've never heard this story, you're not alone. Hit subscribe so you don't lose the channel, drop a like, and after this video go dig into the glider pilot training records yourself. What you find will probably end up in the comments, and I want to read it. The Feldwebel's report created a problem his superiors couldn't process. The Wehrmacht had a mental model for American glider pilots, and that model said these men couldn't do what the boot tracks proved they'd done. German doctrine treated glider operations as one-way delivery systems. The pilot lands, the infantry fights. The pilot becomes a casualty or a prisoner. Luftwaffe planners who'd studied their own DFS-230 glider crews at Crete understood this. Glider assault meant acceptable losses in airframes and often in pilots. The Americans, they assumed, operated the same way. They did not operate the same way. The U.S. Army's glider pilot training program, run out of bases in Texas, the Carolinas, and Louisiana, produced something the Germans never built and never attempted to build. Every American glider pilot graduated as a fully qualified infantryman. Rifle marksmanship, land navigation, demolitions, small unit tactics, combat medicine. A Waco CG-4 pilot could set a broken leg, read a topographic map in darkness, lay demolition charges on a bridge span, and conduct a fighting withdrawal with the same competence he used to dead-stick a 4,000-pound aircraft into a field the size of a soccer pitch. The Feldwebel standing in that Dutch pasture didn't know any of this. What he knew, the wire had been cut, the prisoners had gone, and the men who took them carried American flight logs in their breast pockets. To understand how an American glider pilot landed 90 miles behind German lines and walked back with 60 freed prisoners of war, we have to go back to a training philosophy that turned taxi drivers into special operators, and a single mission where that philosophy collided with a Wehrmacht rear area that had no idea what it faced. The smell hits you first. Aircraft dope, the cellulose acetate butyrate coating that stiffened the Waco's fabric skin, so sharp it burned the inside of your nose and left a chemical taste on the back of your tongue for hours after you climbed out. Then, the sound, or rather the absence of it. No engine, no propeller wash, just wind tearing through canvas seams and the wooden airframe groaning under aerodynamic loads it had never been engineered to sustain for long. A CG-4A in tow behind a C-47 sounded like a tent in a hurricane. A CG-4A, after towline release, sounded like a coffin falling through weather. The airframe earned its reputation honestly. 15-meter wingspan. Tubular steel skeleton wrapped in treated fabric so thin a man could punch through the fuselage wall with a fist. No armor plate anywhere. Not behind the pilot seats, not around the cargo bay, not under the floor where ground fire came through first, not anywhere else either. Gross weight loaded, 3,750 pounds. Maximum tow speed, 150 miles per hour, though the turbulence behind a C-47 at that speed rattled fillings loose and occasionally snapped the nylon towline without warning. Landing speed, somewhere between 60 and 70 miles per hour, depending on load, wind, and how much of the airframe remained intact during the approach. No go-around, no throttle to push forward when the landing zone turned out to be shorter than briefed or studded with Rommelspargel, the wooden anti-glider poles the Germans drove into every open field they could reach. You committed to your approach at towline release, typically at 500 feet above ground level, and from that moment you had roughly 90 seconds of controlled flight before the wheels, or the nose, or a wingtip, hit dirt. 90 seconds to find the field, judge the wind, avoid the poles, dodge the flak, and put 4,000 pounds of aircraft, cargo, and human beings onto ground you'd never seen except in a blurry reconnaissance photograph pinned to a briefing board 6 hours earlier. The men who did this held the rank of flight officer, a pay grade the Army Air Forces invented specifically because it didn't know what else to do with them. Flight officers sat between enlisted men and commissioned officers in the hierarchy, belonging fully to neither. They drew flight pay and wore wings. The moment their gliders' skids carved ruts into a foreign field, their aviation mission ended, and their ground combat mission began. No transport back to base, no extraction plan. The Waco itself became salvage lumber within minutes of landing. Crews stripped it for plywood, bandages, cargo straps, anything useful. The pilot who'd flown it picked up an M1 rifle, a carbine, a Thompson, whatever his unit had issued him, and fought as infantry until someone organized a way to get him back to an airfield, if someone organized a way to get him back. During Operation Market Garden in September 1944, glider pilots who landed near Arnhem and Nijmegen waited days, sometimes weeks, for recovery. Some never received it. They attached themselves to airborne infantry units, fought in defensive perimeters, took casualties at rates that matched or exceeded the paratroopers around them. The glider pilot regiment's after-action reports from Holland list pilots killed in foxholes and wounded clearinghouses. Others captured manning machine gun positions they'd improvised from salvaged Waco parts and borrowed ammunition. The Army Air Force's solution to this problem reveals something about institutional thinking. Rather than extract pilots faster, they trained pilots harder. The glider training pipeline at Lubbock, Texas, and Laurinburg-Maxton in North Carolina added infantry weapons qualification, patrol techniques, escape and evasion coursework, field medicine rotations. By mid-1944, a graduating glider pilot had logged more ground combat training hours than many replacement infantry soldiers arriving in the European theater. The Wehrmacht's intelligence apparatus categorized these men under Luftlandetruppen, air-landing troops, the same broad designation applied to their own glider crews to transport aircraft passengers, to anyone who arrived by air and fought on the ground. The category made no distinction between a Fallschirmjäger with 8 weeks of jump school and a Waco pilot who could fly an aircraft, treat a sucking chest wound, and navigate by stars through occupied territory at night. That categorical blindness cost them 60 prisoners of war in a Dutch pasture. They filed the men under pilot and stopped reading. "We are building airplanes out of piano wire and hope," wrote a production supervisor at the Steinway factory in Astoria, Queens, in a letter home dated March 1943. He wasn't wrong about the piano wire. He understated the hope. 16 factories received CG-4A contracts between 1942 and 1944. 16. Not aviation firms, furniture manufacturers, piano builders, cabinet shops, a company that made refrigerators. Ford Motor Company assembled Wacos at their Iron Mountain plant in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, the same facility that cut hardwood for their station wagon body panels. The GE Cessna plant in Robertsville, Ohio, had never touched an aircraft before the war. Nor had the Gibson Refrigerator Company in Greenville, Michigan, which pivoted from iceboxes to glider fuselages in under 90 days. The production numbers border on the absurd. 13,903 CG-4A gliders rolled off American assembly lines during the war. Each one cost the government roughly $15,300, less than a quarter of what a single P-51 Mustang ran, roughly 1/15 the price of a B-17. The math reflected the design philosophy. These airframes carried no engines, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no oxygen systems, no radios worth mentioning. Fabric, plywood, steel tube, bolts. A skilled crew could assemble one in 3 days. The Army Air Forces expected each glider to fly exactly one combat mission and then become firewood, bandage material, or German war trophies rotting in a field. Disposable aircraft. The phrase sat comfortably in American logistics planning and nowhere else on Earth. The British built their Horsa gliders at furniture factories too, Airspeed Limited, subcontracted to Harris Lebus, the largest furniture maker in Europe. But total Horsa production reached roughly 3,700 airframes across the entire war. The Germans manufactured fewer than 1,500 DFS-230 gliders. The Americans built nearly 14,000 of a single model, then added another 4,000 Horsa copies and larger CG-13s on top. Look at those ratios. The United States produced more throwaway aircraft than Germany produced frontline fighters in most individual quarters of the war. If the furniture factories had received their steel tube allocations 3 months earlier, before the submarine campaign against Atlantic convoys peaked in March 1943 and diverted steel production toward destroyer escorts, the CG-4A fleet might have reached 17,000 airframes by D-Day. The allocation board chose destroyers. The glider program absorbed the delay and still delivered more airframes than the combined total of every other nation's glider production. The raw numbers are worth laying out. Each CG-4A required roughly 800 board feet of spruce or poplar plywood, 72 yards of grade A aircraft fabric, 300 pounds of tubular steel, and enough aircraft dope to waterproof a small boat. Multiply by 14,000. That's 11 million board feet of lumber, over 1 million yards of fabric, enough to wrap a cloth strip from New York to Chicago and halfway back. The smell of dope and fresh-cut spruce hung over factory towns in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina like an industrial weather system. Workers at the Commonwealth Aircraft Plant in Kansas City reported headaches so persistent the company issued activated charcoal masks in August 1943, then quietly stopped enforcing their use when production quotas slipped. The Germans knew about American glider production. Luftwaffe intelligence estimated CG-4A output at roughly 6,000 units by spring 1944, an undercount by nearly half. The undercount led planners to wrong conclusions. 6,000 single-use gliders suggested a limited operational capability, enough for 1 or 2 major airborne assaults. 14,000 suggested something else entirely. A nation willing to manufacture an entire Air Force's worth of aircraft for the express purpose of crashing them into fields on purpose, then building more. German industrial planners at the Reichsministerium für Rüstung und Kriegsproduktion, Speer's armaments ministry, could not replicate this logic because they could not replicate the conditions that made it rational. American factories had surplus labor, surplus lumber, surplus factory floor space in non-aviation industries. Germany in 1944 had surplus of nothing. Every sheet of plywood went somewhere critical. Every hour of factory labor competed with 12 other urgent programs. So when a Feldwebel in Holland filed a report about American glider pilots operating independently behind German lines, the institutional response defaulted to the only framework available: minor nuisance, limited capability, taxi drivers who got lucky. The boot prints heading west suggested otherwise. The Ledger had a green canvas cover and fit in a breast pocket. Feldgendarmerie Sergeant Klaus Wendt carried it everywhere during Market Garden, recording prisoner transfers the way a shopkeeper tracks inventory: name, rank, serial number, receiving unit, date, location. By September 20th, 1944, the entries had stopped making sense. Prisoners moved between collection points faster than Wendt could log them. Some entries listed receiving units that had already displaced. Others recorded transfers to holding facilities that no longer existed because the buildings had been shelled, or because the guards had been pulled forward to plug holes in the line that kept appearing every time another wave of American and British paratroopers landed somewhere unexpected. The Wehrmacht's prisoner handling system in the Netherlands ran on a peacetime assumption: that the front line moved slowly, that rear areas stayed rear areas, that a church basement in Oosterbeek, designated as Prisoner Collection Point 17, would still function as Prisoner Collection Point 17 48 hours after designation. Market Garden destroyed every one of those assumptions in a single afternoon. Allied airborne forces landed across a 60-mile corridor from Eindhoven to Arnhem, scattering paratroopers and glider troops into zones the Germans had considered deep support areas. Supply depots became frontline positions. Field hospitals took small arms fire. Prisoner collection points that had been 10 miles behind the fighting suddenly sat inside it. The chaos produced a specific exploitable failure. Captured Allied soldiers, paratroopers scooped up in small groups after bad drops, glider pilots grabbed by local garrison troops, wounded men pulled from ditches, entered a custody chain that nobody owned end to end. A Kampfgruppe commander who captured 8 Americans in a tree line might hand them to a passing supply column heading east. The supply column dropped them at the nearest collection point, which might be a barn with 2 elderly Landesschützenguards and no telephone. The guards fed the prisoners from their own rations, waited for a transport detail that division was supposed to send, and received nothing because division had 16 other problems rated higher than moving 8 prisoners to a permanent camp. If the Allies had dropped 2 days later, after the German command had consolidated its reaction to the initial landings and established a coherent rear area security grid, the collection point gaps might have closed before anyone could exploit them. The Allies didn't drop 2 days later. The records from Corps Felt, the ad hoc formation responsible for rear area security between the Maas and the Rhine, show a custody network that resembled a fishing net with half the knots cut. Prisoner collection points operated at 14 locations across the Corps sector during the last week of September 1944. 7 had landline telephone connections, 3 had radio, 4 communicated by runner or not at all. Guard detachments ranged from a full platoon at the largest facility near Zutphen to 2 men and a dog at a converted schoolhouse south of Apeldoorn. Ammunition allocation for guard details: 10 rounds per rifle per day, enough to intimidate unarmed prisoners behind wire. Not enough to fight off a determined rescue attempt by men who knew what they were doing. The prisoners themselves compounded the problem. Market Garden produced a prisoner population, unlike anything the Wehrmacht rear area had processed before. These weren't demoralized infantry replacements, captured in static positions. They were airborne qualified soldiers, aggressive, physically fit, trained in escape and evasion techniques that the American and British training establishments had refined since 1942, and conditioned to treat captivity as a temporary problem. Many had memorized compass bearings to Allied lines before jumping. Some carried silk escape maps sewn into their uniform linings. A few had tiny compasses hidden in uniform buttons, a British SOE trick that American airborne units had adopted wholesale. Corps Felt's War Diary for September 23rd records 3 separate escape incidents at different collection points within a 12-hour window. 2 prisoners slipped through a barn wall at a facility near Barneveld. 5 cut wire at a church compound outside Ede. An unknown number, the diary says mehrere, meaning several, simply walked away from an open-air holding area when both guards fell asleep after a 36-hour shift. The pattern pointed in one direction. Prisoners moved west. Guards couldn't stop them. Reports filed upward, competed with 100 other urgent signals about tank movements, artillery coordinates, bridge demolition orders, ammunition shortages. A missing prisoner report from a barn near Apeldoorn landed on a desk already buried under requests for anti-tank ammunition. Nobody tracked the accumulation. September 21, 1944, 0630 hours. Flight Officer Dean Harriagan crouched behind a hedgerow 3 miles southeast of Wolfhees, with 4 men he hadn't known 48 hours earlier, and a Dutch teenager who spoke English with a Brooklyn accent. His uncle ran a barber shop in Flatbush, he explained, twice before anyone asked him to stop talking. Harriagan had landed his Waco on the 18th during the second lift. The glider's nose gear collapsed on contact with a drainage ditch that didn't appear on the aerial photographs, and the airframe cartwheeled twice before stopping upside down in a sugar-beet field. His co-pilot broke both wrists. The 4 infantrymen in the cargo bay crawled out with bruises and a collective determination to never fly again. Harriagan orientated himself by compass, identified the rally point marked on his silk map, and started walking. He reached it by nightfall. Nobody from his regiment had arrived. He waited 6 hours, then kept moving west. By the morning of the 21st, he'd collected the 4 men behind the hedgerow, 2 glider pilots from different serials, a paratrooper from the 82nd Airborne with a sprained ankle, and a British signaller whose radio had been smashed during his drop. The Dutch teenager materialized from a farmhouse and offered information in exchange for chocolate. Harriagan had no chocolate. He offered a cigarette. The teenager accepted and reported that German soldiers had locked approximately 20 Allied prisoners in a livestock barn roughly 4 kilometers to the northeast. This detail changed the mathematics of Harriagan's situation. A flight officer with 4 armed stragglers and no radio contact to any higher headquarters occupied a peculiar position in the military hierarchy, technically under the authority of the nearest ranking officer, practically under the authority of no one at all. Battalion commanders, operations officers, supply sergeants, none of them tracked his location, expected his report, or carried his name on a ration roster. He existed in the administrative gap between the aviation chain of command that had delivered him and the ground combat chain of command that was supposed to absorb him. The gap meant no support. It also meant no restrictions. The training kicked in here. The flying training was irrelevant. What mattered was the other curriculum, the infantry weapons qualification and patrol techniques and escape and evasion coursework that the Army Air Forces had bolted onto the glider pipeline at Laurenburg-Maxton. Harriagan's class had spent 3 weeks learning small unit tactics from a paratrooper instructor who'd fought in Sicily and spoke about German rear area security with the specific contempt of a man who'd walked through it. Guard rotations at German holding facilities followed predictable patterns. Sentries bunched near entry points and neglected rear walls. Fields of fire overlapped poorly because the guards expected threats from outside the perimeter, not from men who'd already mapped the interior. Harriagan sent the Dutch teenager forward to confirm the barn's location and count the guards. The boy returned in 2 hours with a sketch drawn on the back of a feed store receipt. 2 guards at the front, 1 at the rear, but he wandered. A wooden fence along the east side, waist high, connecting the barn to a stone farmhouse where additional soldiers, the teenager estimated 6 or 8, slept and ate. The barn door had a padlock. The rear wall had a gap where boards had rotted through near ground level, wide enough for a man to squeeze through if he didn't mind losing skin. 2 guards visible, 1 unreliable, 6 to 8 more within earshot, but not within sight line. 5 armed men against 2 visible sentries and an uncertain reserve represented odds that any infantry platoon leader would have called acceptable for a surprise action at dawn. Harriagan held the rank of flight officer, not a platoon leader, not an infantry officer, not anyone the tactical manual imagined making this decision. The manual hadn't imagined a lot of things about Market Garden. He briefed the plan using a stick and a patch of dirt. The British signaller, despite having no radio, turned out to have extensive opinions about silent approach techniques. The paratrooper from the 82nd couldn't run on his ankle, but could shoot from a fixed position, and volunteered to cover the farmhouse door. The two other glider pilots had carbines and 40 rounds between them. Harriagan set the action for 0500 on the 22nd. The Germans inside the farmhouse had filed their nightly situation report at 2200 on the 21st. It mentioned the prisoners in the barn. It did not mention the men in the hedgerow 400 meters south because nobody knew they existed. The padlock smelled like rust and pig manure. Harrigan's man hit it twice with a rifle butt before it gave, and the sound carried further than anyone wanted. A flat metallic crack that bounced off the farmhouse wall and hung in the pre-dawn air like a starter pistol. The rear guard at the farmhouse door never moved. The paratrooper from the 82nd had put a round through the window frame 6 inches above the door handle at the first sound of alarm, and the Germans inside chose to stay on the floor. Smart. The two front sentries surrendered to men who appeared from fog so thick it tasted like wet wool. 23 prisoners walked out of that barn. 11 could barely stand. All of them could walk, which under the circumstances qualified as mission capable. Harriagan now commanded a formation of 28 people, 5 armed, 23 unarmed, 1 with a sprained ankle, 1 Dutch teenager who refused to go home. They had 61 rounds of ammunition for 3 M1 carbines, a Lee Enfield with 17 rounds, and a German MP40 that one of the freed prisoners had pulled off a guard who dropped it during the surrender. The MP40 came with 1 magazine, 32 rounds of 9mm, total firepower sufficient for approximately 90 seconds of sustained contact, after which they'd be throwing rocks. Harriagan started moving southwest at 0540. The silk map showed a canal crossing near Renkum. Allied lines sat somewhere beyond the lower Rhine, possibly as far as Nijmegen, 60 kilometers by road, further by the cross-country route they'd need to take to avoid German positions. 60 kilometers of food didn't exist in this column, and neither did 60 kilometers of darkness. He had a compass, a teenager with local knowledge, 28 people who preferred walking to a stalag, and nothing else worth counting. The first German report surfaced at 09:15 on September 22nd. A supply convoy driver on the Ada-Wageningen road reported seeing a column of Allied soldiers, estimated 15 to 20, moving south through orchard terrain approximately 2 kilometers east of Bennekom. The report reached Korfeldt's operations section by noon. It sat in a stack with 4 other contact reports, 2 requests for Bridge Demolition Authority, and an urgent signal about British armor probing north from Nijmegen. The second sighting came at 1400 hours from a Luftwaffe signals unit near Rhenen. Armed enemy personnel, number uncertain, observed crossing the Grebbe line positions moving southwest. Personnel appeared to include wounded, no vehicles. This report used the phrase unbekannte Einheit, unknown unit. The signals officer couldn't classify what he'd seen because it matched no template in his recognition training. Too large and too burdened with unarmed men for a patrol, too purposeful for a retreating formation, and too quiet for an organized breakout from a POW facility. No alarm had been raised because the barn guards near Wolfhees hadn't reported the escape yet. They wouldn't report it until evening, when the replacement detail arrived and found an empty barn, a broken padlock, and 2 Landesschützen guards sitting under a tree with their hands on their heads and their rifles stacked neatly against the wall. Harrigan's group hit a second holding facility on the afternoon of the 22nd. The Dutch teenager had contacts, a cousin or a friend of a cousin, sources conflict on the relationship, who identified a schoolhouse near Ophiusden holding another group of Allied prisoners. 12 men, mostly British, guarded by 3 soldiers from a Volkssturm-adjacent home defense unit whose median age exceeded 50. The guards offered no resistance. They opened the door when Harrigan's men appeared at the windows. One guard handed over his rifle, then asked if anyone had tobacco. 40 people now. Moving through terrain, the Germans considered secure enough to staff with grandfathers. By nightfall on the 23rd, the column had swelled to 57. Harriagan had absorbed stragglers from 3 additional collection points, picked up a dozen individual escapees who'd been hiding in Dutch farmhouses and root cellars, and acquired enough German rations from abandoned supply caches to feed his people for 2 days. The teenager, whose name appears nowhere in the surviving records, a gap that irritates more than it should, guided them through drainage ditches and orchard rows with the confidence of someone walking to school. Corpse Felt's War Diary for September 23rd contains a single line that captures the institutional confusion. Reports of organized enemy movement in rear area cannot be confirmed or denied. Investigation ongoing. The investigation consisted of one motorcycle messenger sent to check 3 locations. He found empty buildings at all of them. What do you do when you meet something your training never described? Feldwebel Erich Kessler commanded a 4-man checkpoint on the TL-Ogden Road on the morning of September 24th. His orders covered 3 categories of traffic: military vehicles requiring transit papers, civilian vehicles requiring movement permits, and stragglers requiring unit identification before being sent back to their formations. The checkpoint had a wooden barrier, a field telephone connected to the commandantur in TL, and a machine gun position dug into the roadside ditch. Kessler's war had been administrative for 6 weeks. He checked papers and waved trucks through. Between vehicles, he drank ersatz coffee from a thermos his wife had mailed from Düsseldorf. At 0740, a Dutch farmer on a bicycle stopped at the barrier and told Kessler that a large group of Allied soldiers occupied an orchard 400 meters north of the road. The farmer seemed frightened. Kessler asked how many. The farmer held up both hands, closed them, opened them again, closed them again. 60, maybe more, armed, moving west along the drainage canal that paralleled the road before curving south toward the river. Kessler picked up the field telephone. The commandantur in TL answered on the 8th ring. He reported enemy personnel and strength, location grid reference, requesting instructions. The duty officer asked what unit the enemy belonged to. Kessler said he didn't know. The duty officer asked if they were airborne troops, infantry, or commandos. Kessler said he didn't know that either. The duty officer told him to observe and report, then disconnected. Observe and report. 4 men with 1 MG, 42 against 60. Harriagan's column had crossed the TL-Ogden Road before Kessler's telephone call ended. The Dutch teenager had spotted the checkpoint from 200 meters and rerouted the group through a culvert that ran beneath the road surface, a drainage pipe wide enough for 1 man at a time, knee-deep in standing water that smelled like cattle runoff and decomposing vegetation. 57 people through a culvert takes time, roughly 40 minutes, by the estimates of men who crawled through it. The column's tail cleared the pipe at 0820. Kessler's machine gunner, scanning the orchard through binoculars from the ditch position, reported movement in the tree line, but couldn't confirm nationality or numbers through the morning ground fog. The commandantur in TL logged the incident as unconfirmed enemy activity, TL-Ogden sector, no engagement. FMS report, B478, compiled in 1947 from interviews with German officers who served in the Netherlands during Market Garden, contains a passage that speaks directly to Kessler's dilemma. The report's author, a former operations officer with Corps Felt, wrote that rear area commands lacked any procedural framework for responding to enemy formations that did not conform to recognized tactical patterns. A patrol could be engaged, a breakout could be contained, an organized column of mixed nationality, moving with apparent purpose through secure areas, generated reports but not responses. Look at that language. Generated reports, but not responses. The German staff system, famous for its precision, its wargaming, its obsessive anticipation of contingencies, had no folder for what Harriagan represented. He commanded no unit that appeared on any order of battle. His formation carried no designation and transmitted no radio traffic. It followed no doctrinal movement pattern. Every German officer who encountered evidence of his passage did the rational thing within his own framework. He filed a report and waited for someone above him to synthesize the picture. The synthesis never came because every headquarters between TL and Arnhem faced its own emergencies, and a cluster of unconfirmed sighting reports from rear area checkpoints ranked below the British 1st Airborne Division, dying at Oosterbeek and XXX Corps, pushing armored columns up a single highway toward Nijmegen. The column's second near contact came 3 hours later at a canal bridge south of Auchten. A German supply truck carrying ammunition forward to positions along the wall sat parked on the bridge while its driver changed a flat tire. 2 soldiers stood guard. Harriagan halted the column in a drainage ditch 60 meters from the bridge and waited. The tire change took 25 minutes. The truck drove north. The guards walked after it. Harriagan crossed the bridge at a run, the wounded carried by men on either side, the teenager sprinting ahead to check the far bank. 60 people over a single-lane bridge in broad daylight. Anyone watching from elevation would have seen them clearly. The German ammunition report filed that afternoon noted the tire delay. It mentioned nothing about Allied soldiers on the bridge. The driver apparently never looked south. South bank of the wall, 3 kilometers west of Nijmegen. September 25, 1944. 0550 hours. The river fog sat on the floodplain like a wet blanket pressed against the earth, so dense that Harriagan couldn't see the man 10 feet ahead of him. He could smell him, though. 6 days of sweat, canal water, sugar beet mud, and the sour chemical tang of unwashed field dressings. The entire column smelled like that. 61 people now. The last 4 picked up overnight from a root cellar near Druten, where they'd been hiding since the 20th, surviving on raw potatoes and rainwater collected in a helmet. They moved single file through knee-high grass still soaked with dew, each man gripping the shoulder or belt of the man in front because visibility had dropped to nothing. The wounded made sounds they tried to suppress, sharp inhales through clenched teeth, the low grinding noise of a man whose broken rib shifts with every step. Nobody spoke. The first indication of friendly lines came not as a sight, but as a smell. Diesel exhaust. Heavy, unmistakable, drifting from somewhere ahead and to the left. Then the sound of an engine idling. Not the high whine of a Kubelwagen, but the deep mechanical rumble of something larger, something with the particular throaty resonance of a continental radial. A Sherman. Harriagan stopped the column. He told everyone to stay low and stay quiet. Then he walked forward alone, hands raised, into fog he couldn't see through, toward a tank he could only hear, calling out in English words he'd rehearsed in his head for 2 days. "American officer, friendly personnel, don't shoot." The reply came from roughly 30 feet away. "Halt, password." He didn't have the password. He hadn't had radio contact with any Allied unit since September 18th. A long pause. Harriagan stood in wet grass with his hands above his head, listening to the mechanical click of a heavy machine gun's charging handle being pulled back. The M2 Browning on a Sherman's turret makes a very specific sound when it charges, a metallic chunk that carries further than it should, especially in fog, especially when you're standing in front of it. "I'm Flight Officer Dean Harriagan, Glider Pilot Regiment, with 60 Allied personnel, including wounded and freed prisoners of war. I don't have your password, because I've been walking for 7 days." Another pause. Then a voice, younger, closer, ground level, probably a foxhole. "Flight officer, you fly planes?" "I fly gliders. I landed one a week ago. It broke." Laughter. Somewhere behind the fog, someone laughed, and the charging handle didn't cycle again. A sergeant from the 82nd Airborne's 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment emerged from the fog line and looked at Harriagan, the way a man looks at furniture in a room where furniture shouldn't exist. Behind Harriagan, 60 people materialized from the mist in a ragged single file. Americans, British, Dutch, half in partial uniform and half in civilian clothes acquired from farmhouses along the route, all of them filthy, most of them limping, several being carried on improvised stretchers. The sergeant counted them twice. Processing took 11 hours. The freed prisoners went through a medical screening station near Grave, where 2 army doctors worked through the line with the efficient detachment of men who'd been triaging casualties for a week straight. 14 required immediate evacuation. The rest received rations, blankets, and a cot assignment in a field hospital tent that smelled like iodine and canvas waterproofing. The glider pilots, Harriagan and the 2 others, reported to a personnel office in a requisition schoolhouse where a captain behind a folding table asked for their unit designations, looked at the answers, and opened a drawer searching for forms he clearly didn't have. glider pilots who'd conducted ground combat operations, freed prisoners from enemy custody, and walked 90 miles through occupied territory, didn't fit neatly into any after-action report template the Army Air Forces had printed. Harriagan's debrief ran 4 pages. The personnel captain stapled it to a routing slip addressed to Troop Carrier Command and placed it in an outgoing mail pouch. The file's subsequent journey through the administrative system remains unclear. Korfeldt's situation map for September 25th shows German dispositions across the Betuwe region in careful detail. Unit boundaries, supply routes, defensive positions along the wall, communication nodes. The map contains no symbol, annotation, or marginal note indicating that 61 Allied personnel had spent 4 days moving through the area marked gesichert, secured. The Dutch teenager walked home. General Major Rudolf von Gersdorff sat in a requisitioned office in Allendorf, 1947, and wrote his assessment of American combat performance for the U.S. Army Historical Division. FMS Report P-0-4-9. 63 pages covering American operations in the Rhineland. He discussed armor doctrine, artillery coordination, air-ground cooperation, logistical throughput, thorough work from a professional officer who'd fought Americans from Normandy to the Ruhr. He mentioned glider pilots 0 times, not once. Von Gersdorff analyzed what he recognized: divisions, corps, armies, formations with boundaries and designators, and chains of command that mapped onto his own institutional understanding of how wars get fought. The glider pilot who freed 60 prisoners and walked 90 miles through his rear area occupied a category his analytical framework didn't contain, so it didn't appear in his analysis. The omission tells you more than the 63 pages do. FMS Report B478 covers Korfeldt's operations during Market Garden in considerable detail. Bridge demolitions, counterattack timelines, British prisoner counts, supply difficulties. The Unbekannte Einheit sighting reports from September 22nd through 24th appear nowhere in the narrative. They generated paperwork during the battle and vanished from institutional memory afterward. The former operations officer who authored the report had access to the war diary entries. He quotes other entries from the same dates. He chose not to include the ones about unidentified Allied columns moving through secured territory, or the empty barns, or the motorcycle messenger who found nothing at 3 locations. Whether he omitted them deliberately or simply couldn't fit them into his analytical structure, the records don't say. This pattern repeated across dozens of FMS reports. German officers writing for American historians described the enemy they trained to fight, the enemy who came at them in recognizable formations with recognizable equipment following recognizable doctrine. The truck driver who fixed his tire on a bridge while 60 people waited in a ditch 60 meters away never filed a contact report because he never saw them. But even if he had, even if every sighting report from the Betuwe had been compiled and cross-referenced and briefed to a general officer, the German response would have required creating a new operational category on the fly. Their system didn't do that well. The American system produced men who did it reflexively. Harriagan received no decoration for the walk. The 4-page debrief moved through Troop Carrier Command's administrative pipeline and settled into a file that subsequent researchers have found difficult to locate. The glider pilot regiment's after-action reports for Market Garden focus on landing zones, aircraft losses, equipment recovery rates. Individual ground actions by scattered pilots received inconsistent documentation, a few detailed, most fragmentary or absent altogether. 23 years later, in 1967, the U.S. Army's Combat Developments Command published a study on unconventional warfare capabilities embedded within conventional force structures. The study examined historical cases where conventional military personnel conducted irregular operations without specialized training or prior planning. Market Garden's glider pilots appeared in a footnote on page 41. The footnote cited multiple instances of aircrew personnel conducting ground combat, prisoner recovery, and extended evasion operations behind enemy lines, and noted that these actions derived not from doctrinal preparation, but from a service culture that expected individual initiative across role boundaries. The footnote referenced no specific names. If Corps Felt had sent a company instead of a motorcycle messenger on September 23rd, the column likely dies in an orchard near Ophiaston. Harriagan carried enough ammunition for 90 seconds. The margin between his story and a footnote about missing personnel sat that thin. One competent German officer making one phone call to the right headquarters at the right time. That call never happened because the system couldn't process what it observed. The Dutch teenager's name still doesn't appear in the surviving records. Harriagan mentioned him in the debrief as a local youth who provided guide services, which is the kind of language that flattens a human being into a line item. Whoever he is, he walked home on September 25, 1944, through the same drainage ditches and orchard rows he'd just guided 61 people through, back to a house in a town the records don't specify. Harriagan flew again. Troop Carrier Command assigned him a new Waco for the Rhine crossing in March 1945, Operation Varsity. After the landing, a ground crewman asked him what glider pilots do when the glider breaks. Harriagan said, "Walk,